Hello, everyone. I hope that we're all back. And welcome to this final panel of the day. Thank you all so much for sticking with us throughout this incredibly exciting event that we're having. And just to say the word exciting one more time, we are also very excited to have our next three speakers on this final panel of the day. So first of all, my name is Dr. Dara Downey, and I lecture in English here in Trinity College Dublin and in a number of other places. And I'm currently working on a literary biography of Shirley Jackson for Palgrave's Literary Lives series, which is great. And that wouldn't be happening if Bernice hadn't introduced me to Jackson's work way back in 2002 when I was just a fresh new postgrad, and didn't really know what I was doing. So, like I say, we're really, really delighted to welcome three amazing panelists who have very generously given up their time during incredibly busy schedules and who are here to talk to us about Jackson's impact, specifically, though not exclusively, on fantasy, horror and science fiction. And all three of them are writers and editors who are working today and whose work intersects in various ways with Jackson's. And so to introduce them very briefly in alphabetical order, there are longer versions of the bios available on our Discord, but we'll start with Ellen Datlow, who is a legendary editor who's worked on multiple mammoth collections of genre fiction over the years, and most recently she has published a collection of stories inspired by Jackson's writing entitled When Things Get Dark, which I've recently finished reading and I absolutely loved it. And this includes, among others, contributions by our next two panelists. So our next panelist is author Elizabeth Hand, who has written lots and lots of things. Personally, I first read Waking the Moon when I was 14 or 15, when I was the only person in Forbidden Planet looking at books. And so it's really just a delight to have you here. She's also written Wilding Hall, the Casneri series, and so she spans a number of genres. And she is currently, very excitingly, working on a contemporary novel set in Hill House, which is entitled A Haunting on the Hill. And our third panelist is Paul Tremblay, who is the author, among multiple things, of A Head Full of Ghosts and The Cabin at the End of the World, which is about to get an adaptation. And he's written lots of other things. And like I say, you can find all of the bios on our Discord link. And all three of our panelists are also involved in the Shirley Jackson Awards, which hopefully we'll get around to talking about a little bit at some point. But just a tiny little bit of housekeeping before we go on to do that. Please don't forget that you can also use our Discord server to add some comments and your thoughts throughout the event, so you can have a conversation outside of the Zoom space. And there's a link to that in the chat at the moment. So we'll be talking for the next 40 minutes, maybe 45 minutes or so, and then we'll leave around 15 minutes at the end for a question and answer session with the audience. So do please add any questions or comments that you might have into the Q&A function, which you'll find down the bottom of your screen. And please remember to leave your microphones off for the rest of the chat. So without further ado, I suppose what I really wanted to ask all three of you, in whichever order you prefer, is what first drew you to the work of Shirley Jackson, how you first encountered her, and what her writing means to you. So Ellen, you have your microphone on. Start with
Sure. Well, I read, the first thing I ever read by her was We've Always Lived in a Castle. And I loved Merricat. I loved the characters. I was a kid. I mean, I don't know how old, I might have been like 12 years old or something. And I just found it intriguing and I just fell in love with it. I was always interested in weird stuff, weird writing, the macabre and horror and fantasy. And that one just really hit me. And then, of course, everyone reads The Lottery in school, or almost everybody. And I'm a short story editor mostly, and short story reader. I came out of short stories from reading them, except for the novel by Shirley. And I love An Ordinary Day with Peanuts, and just her not only her short stories, but I love her nonfiction about the family. I mean, those were twisted, but in a good way, and very funny. So, I mean, that's basically how I got into reading Jackson and appreciating her work. And, we can talk about the anthology later, but yeah, but that's how I got into it.
Brilliant, thank you. Oh, Paul, yes.
So I was first exposed to Shirley Jackson. That's a good way of saying it, right? Exposed. It's funny. I have very few memories of especially in middle school. So in the U.S., that's ages 12 through 14. Being assigned short stories. But I remember in sixth grade, so I was 12 years old, being assigned the lottery. And I would not describe myself as a child as a reader for pleasure. But I vividly remember everything about the room when the teacher was reading the story and discussing it, and I just totally unnerved. Fast forward a bunch of years later, I was a math major and a math graduate student. So oddly, I fell in love with reading while I was in graduate school. First with a story by Joyce Carol Oates, but then Stephen King. But of course, most people when they discover Stephen King end up reading Danse Macabre. And that's where, he had a huge, obviously, chapter and discussed, in quite detail, The Haunting of Hill House. So maybe by that point, I'd got my first high school teaching job, and I was not making very much money as a very small school, but they had an old 70s paperback version of The Haunting of Hill House, which I still have. I guess I haven't returned the book. It's been almost 30 years. Maybe I'll return it at some point. But, reading that, as much as my attraction to Stephen King was, it's interesting, it's creepy. I'd seen all the movies. It was also these blue collar characters. There was just another layer of reality for me with reading Shirley Jackson that felt like, wow, this story feels like, even though she wrote it in the 50s or 60s, depending on the story, feels like it's happening now, in an almost ineffable way. So I sort of burned through as much of her oeuvre as I possibly could.
I know the feeling. And Liz?
Yeah, I remember, as Emma commented earlier in the chat, I read the story Charles when I was very young, about 7 years old, and I just thought it was the funniest thing that I'd ever read. And then went on to read all of the stories in Life Among the Savages and Raising Demons, and from there pretty much jumped into, We've Always Lived in the Castle and Hill House and this Come Along with Me and The Bird's Nest. So, and The Lottery, of course, which like Paul and Ellen read in school. But I was reading them from a very early age, and I knew from a very early age that I wanted to be a writer. And I think I really absorbed this idea, not just that she was writing scary stuff, but this notion of making fiction out of your own life. Reading Life Among the Savages and Demons and thinking like, oh, I'm a kid from a big family of kids, and my parents were nothing like their parents. But I thought this is something you could do with your own life. You could make a story out of it, and somehow at a certain level it will overlap with fiction. And of course, at the time, growing up, I wasn't conscious of that. But I do remember being very much aware of walking around and describing myself as a 7 or 8 year old in the voice that Shirley Jackson used in describing her kids. And then later when I read her other stuff, and I thought like, oh, wow, this is like this person, well, a woman, which for me was another discovery, was that a woman could be writing stuff, scary stories, because most of the books and the stories that I read were by men. And she was the only person I can think of. This is, again, the early to mid 1960s. There were certainly not very many women around who were writers who I was exposed to. And she was probably the very first one.
Yeah, actually, we might come back to that a little bit later. But if you don't mind, just because, it kind of struck me when all three of you were talking that, as an Irish person, this experience of reading, say, something like The Lottery when you're really young, in a school setting where obviously something is being kind of required of you in your reading of it. I suppose I was wondering if any of you could kind of speak to that a little bit, just, let the rest of us know what that was like when you were that age to have been hit with this. I mean, Paul, you say this was formative moment.
Because I was so young, 12 years old, I think the memory that stuck with me is like looking around the room at the other kids. You know, and I certainly I was not one of the popular kids. I did not feel very socially, accepted. I was very awkward. But I remember looking around the room and sort of picking out like who was excited by this notion, who, like I could actually visualize this room of kids where some of them would gleefully just start throwing. If we didn't have rocks, we had books, throwing the books at the teacher. And I mean, it felt a little dangerous, but like in a cool way to be reading it at sort of at that point. And it's been a fun joy to revisit the story since then. And actually, Jeffrey Ford, I remember, changed the reading of that story for me. Maybe it was like 5 years ago. Where he wrote something just online, like maybe even on Facebook or something, about how he had reread it recently, and he thought that maybe she was so upset at the end, besides the fact that she was going to be stoned to death. But he thinks there's some evidence in the text to say that she thinks it was supposed to have been fixed for her not to have been chosen. Which was something I had never considered. So it's such a fun story to go back to and find different, not only emotional reactions to it, but different actual sort of textual reads of it as well.
Oh, I really like that. Okay, thank you. Ellen?
Yeah. I actually don't remember when I know it was not read to me in school. I mean, I'm sure I read it on my own. And because I was already an aficionado of horror and the grotesque and Lovecraft, I don't think it made me feel any worse about the world than I did. But I remember Jeff mentioning that on, I guess, on Facebook, and I need to go back and reread it to see what I think, if that's the case. And I wonder what Jackson's intention was when she wrote it.
Yeah, if only we knew. Liz, you nodding along there.
Yeah, well, I remember reading it probably in 4th or 5th grade in school, and we read everything aloud. The students would read things aloud. So we would all take turns, go around the room. And I was like Ellen, and maybe like Paul as well, and yourself. I love scary stories and movies and things, but I was totally taken off guard. I had no idea what this story was about. And to be reading it and, going from this initial excitement of, oh, it's lottery day, and thinking this is like a, Little House on the Prairie sort of scenario, but in New England. and then gradually everything being revealed, I thought it was great, but I also thought it was genuinely horrific, because it was so, the combination of the everyday and this whole notion, what we now call sunlit horror, where you have a very, seemingly bucolic, idyllic setting, and then the horror intrudes, as in, Midsummer, much more graphically. So, and that made a really big impression on me too. I suddenly thought, wow, thinking, geez, this is the first time I had been exposed to something like that as well. That something that terrible things could happen in broad daylight among people that you know really well, including your own family members.
Yeah, that there isn't some sort of separate fantasy or horror realm where you get to kind of shove all of that neatly and you can go back to your everyday life, that it's here. I have to say, I'm very envious, because in this country, when you're around that age, you end up reading quite miserable stuff about the famine and the War of Independence. And there's a lot less of this expansiveness that you've all been talking about very eloquently. So I suppose, kind of moving on from that a little bit, I wanted to ask Liz and Paul in particular, is there any particular sort of element of your own writing that you see as being specifically influenced by Jackson, or is there anything kind of in her work, apart from the lottery, that you would see as having kind of moved directly into your own fiction? Or
Liz, go first this time, so I can think.
Thank you, Paul. Such a gentleman. I think stylistically, when I started writing, self-consciously as an adult or as a young adult, I was not thinking of Shirley Jackson as an influence. But I think thematically, I was always conscious of her as somebody who was a huge influence on me. The whole notion of mental illness and the unreliable narrator, the role that houses play, the domestic realm, but also big houses. families, all of that stuff. I was very, very conscious of absorbing as sort of like a scaffolding for my own work. But I genuinely feel that I cannot think of anyone. I'm sure there are people out there who would, say otherwise, but it's hard for me to think of any contemporary writer of, the supernatural or fantastica in the more general sense, or even, certain kinds of autofiction or, woman-centered fiction, who has not been influenced by Jackson's work, even if you are not specifically aware of it. It's in the air we breathe, and it's in the water we drink. It's in other books that we've read that were not written by her. Somebody like Stephen King, who Paul mentioned with Danse Macabre, who wrote very vividly about Jackson and acknowledges her importance in his own work. So if you've read Stephen King, you've been influenced by Shirley Jackson, even if you haven't read Shirley Jackson.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think his short story Strawberry Spring is possibly the most Jackson thing he's ever written in lots of ways. People don't really talk about it enough. I'm going to just hog the floor for 1 minute because Liz, I was really thinking last night, it only just occurred to me that in my head, that office that in Waking the Moon that Sweeney gets in that museum where she's like stuck up on the top floor and she's doing this slightly miserable job. I hadn't realized, but I've been setting Elizabeth's office in the Bird's Nest in exactly the same mental space in my head. And yeah, anyway, that's just my little thing that I wanted to say. So Paul, you were going to jump in there.
Yeah, I think, sort of in retrospect, particularly with, I guess, especially when I started focusing on horror novels, over, I guess, almost the past 10 years now, starting with The Head Full of Ghosts. I think there's so many things that draw me to Shirley's work. But the thing I think I learned from her and try to emulate is the idea of, I think most of my novels, if there is a supernatural element, it's ambiguous. Like I don't tell the reader if it is or not, and that's not necessarily a Shirley thing. But the thing that always strikes me when I read almost all of her stories is that this feels like it could happen, or it can happen, or it has happened. And that's quite different from reading, obviously, like the Clive Barker piece, who I adore, etc. But I mean, it's such a unique thing, and in a lot of ways, it makes it more terrifying for me that no, this is if a supernatural intrusion were to happen, as it happens in a Shirley Jackson story, this is what it would look like. This is what it would feel like. So, I suppose I try to emulate that a lot in my novels. And partly if it's good when I write something that long, it's like my inner skeptic, my inner Shirley Jackson skeptic will be like, no, it wouldn't be this obvious. It would be very subtle and it would be very hard to identify. Hopefully, never get the same effect that she's able to create. But hopefully, part of the effect is it's the kind of thing where you may not be terrified, or you may not feel that full dread in the moment. It may happen later when you're thinking about the book, or, when you wake up in the middle of the night or something like that.
Yeah, and I think, kind of actually riffing on some of the things that people have been saying in the Discord chat, there's also kind of that sense of the ridiculous, I think, that she does so nicely. And I've just finished reading A Head Full of Ghosts, and there are a few moments where you're like, ha, yeah, that's exactly how two sisters would be with one another. That, it doesn't always have to be kind of high seriousness.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. I mean, I think one of the things that no one can do, like I've read a few writers who can do this, what Jackson does, although, well, I don't know, I shouldn't say no one can do it, but like her humor, I think is so underrated. I mean, it's obvious in Life Among the Savages, but within the novels themselves, to have that balance, to be so clever and wicked and funny in The Haunting of Hill House, and in The Sundial in particular, which I think is one of my favorite novels that doesn't get talked about as much as the other ones. Just, I don't know, that humor is just, it's so, it makes everything feel more real, as opposed to, and it's not humor like in the way a horror comedy would be described as, which is typically the horror is the result of the humor. It's just totally, I don't know, it's not explaining it well. It's just Jackson-esque, I guess I would say.
Yeah, I think just kind of small things that happen between people off to the side, and yeah, that kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, kind of moving on from that, Ellen, I was really interested in the process of you putting together that collection, When Things Get Dark, stories inspired by Shirley Jackson. And yeah, I guess I was just kind of wondering what was the impetus behind the book, and maybe how did you go about choosing the pieces or the authors?
Well, the impetus was actually the Shirley Jackson Awards, it turns out, because I started talking about it. I started discussing it at ReaderCon in 2019, in July, I guess it must have been. And I don't remember what was going on, how we started talking about it. But of course, ReaderCon has been the host of the Shirley Jackson Awards since they began. And so somehow that combination, someone must have said something to me, wanted to do an anthology on Jackson. And I said, oh, that's a really interesting idea. And but the thing is, I didn't follow up on it initially because I knew I'd have to contact the estate because I would not do it without them knowing. I wanted to let them know and hopefully get their quote unquote blessing for it. So I kind of didn't do anything about it. I was just busy. And then I went to the Worldcon, which I think was in Dublin, actually. So it must have been in August or September, I forget. But right after that, and I was trying to sell another anthology to someone at Titan Books, Joyce Sanderson. And initially I was trying to sell a non-theme anthology, but then I said, no, we've got to do a theme. And somehow they came up with Jackson again. I did not tell them that I had been thinking about it. So, and I don't know if it was a bicentennial, it was a centennial. I don't know why at that point they came up with this idea in England. Okay. And I said, oh, what a great idea, but I need to contact the estate, which I did. And I contacted Lawrence, who was extremely gracious and generous. And I told him what my idea was. I hadn't sold the book yet, and I didn't know who I was going to have in it. I gave him some ideas of who I was going to try to get into the book. And some of those people made it into the book. And he seemed happy with the idea. So that's when Titan and I did the contract and started to do the book. The way I came up with the writers was some of the writers were people who I felt were influenced by Jackson. I mean, Liz seemed perfect for that. Kelly Link seemed perfect for that. I mean, there's certain writers who I just know, I've been reading their short work for so long and some of their long work that it just seemed, oh my God, yes, these people belong in the book. But I tried to get, with any kind of anthology, you kind of try to get a good variety of writers. And sometimes it's serendipity, think, well, I don't think this writer is very Jackson-esque, but maybe, you never know. And that kind of happened with Richard Kadrey, who's known for his Sandman Slim books and Hunk and Violence. And he said, yeah, sure, I'll try it. And he came up with a story that was not like that, not like his usual work at all. And so, what I tried to do was reach out to various writers who I thought would do a good job, basically, and give me a variety of what could be in the book. And that's basically how it came about. But I think it was ReaderCon.
That's, yeah, I think there are so many of these things that wouldn't happen if people just weren't all in the same place at the same time talking about things. And, that's part of why Bernice and I have ended up being Shirley Jackson people over the years. But yeah, I mean, Liz or Paul, do you want to talk a little bit about the experience of being part of this volume, or?
Yeah, did I talk to either of you at that ReaderCon? Did it come up then? Do you remember, Liz? I don't know if Paul was there.
Yeah, I'm sure I was there.
Actually, you don't
remember
either.
No. Yeah, it's funny. I guess none of us remember. I'm surprised you remember anything about 2019, other than 2019 was like,
oh, that's so long ago.
Golden year before. No, I mean, the experience was first an honor. It was also like the type of thing is like whatever other deadlines I have, I will put aside to try to come up with a story. So it was a combination of being very excited, but also very nervous, because I knew Ellen was going to have like a bunch of writers involved. But at the same time, it was an absolute pleasure. It gave me an excuse. Like the story I ended up writing, definitely, Ellen was clear. She wanted no pastiche, in the stories, but I wanted to take two of my favorites and wanted to try to, milk out or squeeze out some of the feel into my story. So those with the short story, The Intoxicated, and I already mentioned The Sundial. So I kind of spliced those two a little bit together to come up with my story called The Party.
Yeah, I think the boundaries between pastiche and influencer are fairly fuzzy ones anyway, one way or the other. Liz?
Yeah, I do remember talking with you about it, Ellen, but I don't recall if it was at ReaderCon or on the phone or another time. But yeah, I was thrilled. I'll echo everything that Paul said. I was thrilled to be asked to be part of it, and I immediately just wanted to jump in and had an idea. A story called For Sale by Owner, and was based on experiences I had with two of my friends. The story's about three middle-aged women who basically do breaking and entering into empty, or not empty, but unoccupied houses, camps in a remote part of New England. They just, they try the doors, and if the doors open, they'll go inside and just look around the house, and then they leave. So it was very easy for me to write it based on some actual experiences that I had with friends, and actually on my own. But we never, nothing proceeded to the extremes that it does in the actual short story. So, but yeah, it was fun, and it also seemed like kind of a Shirley Jackson thing to do. Something I could imagine Shirley Jackson doing if she'd had the opportunity or the impulse.
Oh, Paul, I just realized you're really good at writing female characters. I mean, the characters, the two main characters in the party are female. The head full of ghosts is from female point of view. And it just hit me that you're really good at that. That's just comment.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
I was just going to make your compliment to me. I was going to make a joke, when Liz is around, make sure your door is locked. Jeez.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm very envious. I must admit, it's only really been in the last few years that I've really kind of worked out what the American concept of a camp or a cabin is, even though, over here we get so much of that in like our popular culture, everything from Evil Dead onwards, but it's still, I don't know. I think the first time I watched Evil Dead, I was like, all right, someone just built something and they left it there. I don't really know how that works. So it's kind of fascinating that there are other ways of living that we didn't really think about in this country. But yeah, and actually, Liz, you kind of slightly anticipated my next question, which is that I certainly found that there was a very strong New England focus to the collection. And I really felt like the Summer People as a story kind of hung over really an awful lot of the various contributions to it. And I suppose I was wondering, Ellen in particular, was this a deliberate decision, or did it just kind of work out this way?
Not at all. And until you mentioned it, it never occurred to me. I'd have to actually go through all the stories to see how many took place in New England, because I'm not sure. I have no idea. That's the interesting thing of editing any kind of anthology, whether it's original or not, even if it's reprints. You don't know what you have until you're finished, and then sometimes you have sub themes and things that are hitting off of each other, and you just don't know. And that's kind of the joy for me of editing any kind of anthology, that until you get all the stories in, or most of them, and you have no idea what you're going to, it's like, ooh, and then you have to mold it kind of a little bit. But no, I didn't realize that.
No, it's definitely there. And I suppose in a way, something that Janice and myself have been talking about over the last while is that often in Shirley Jackson's work, she doesn't specify that it's New England either. It's maybe kind of almost more of an atmosphere, or possibly even an assumption that we're making about a certain kind of American sort of horror or gothic or...
Yeah, no, I'm trying to just think about which some of the stories and where they take place. Some take, at least one takes place on a highway, by Genevieve Valentine. It's like kind of suburban, probably like, it's just a woman driving, leaving her husband, maybe, or being killed by her husband. Anyway, it's many possibilities, but it totally takes place on a highway, which could be anywhere. That's not New England, it could be probably malls, just going past all those horrible landscape of America. So not all of them take place in New England.
No, absolutely not. Liz, I know that your work dovetails a lot with New England. You often sort of reference Maine in particular in your writing? I mean, do you think that there's something specifically sort of attractive about that part of East Coast America for Gothic stories? Or
Well, I grew up in a part of upstate New York that, one end of our road was in New York State and the other end was in Connecticut, which is part of New England. And for the last 35 years, I've lived in Maine. So I grew up, pretty much as a New Englander, and I identify with that. So, and certainly there's a great American literary tradition of the Gothic and rural Gothic, as Faye was talking about earlier, Faye and Kevin. So I just felt like that was what I know and knew, and also what I was drawn to. I'm very drawn to those landscapes, the kind of bleak but beautiful, sometimes sullied, despoiled, and I'm drawn to those kind of landscapes in the UK as well. When I have written stories or novels that have been set there, they have been in places like in West Penwith and Cornwall and parts of the British Isles that to me look very, very much like New England, or obviously New England reminded the first white settlers of that. So I don't think that it's I certainly think there have been all kinds of horror stories and novels. Dan Shawn writes about the Midwest. Peter Straub did as well. But I think there is something about New England, especially if you've lived there or if you vacation there. I think for a lot of Americans who may not live in New England or the Northeast, a lot of people do come here to vacation. Maine is called vacation land. So a lot of people who might not have lived in this area are familiar with it from taking a vacation as a child or as an adult, and then being exposed to it again. Stephen King is probably, the great disseminator of the New England literary gene throughout, certainly through horror and supernatural writing. But I'd be interested in what Paul thinks about that.
Yeah, I've grown up in Massachusetts and lived in New England pretty much my whole life. So for me, just about everything is set in New England, partly because I'm not good at research. I studied math. I didn't study how to do research for writing. And I grew up next to Salem, so like a perfectly New England thing. Like, in Salem, it's a very strange town if you've never been to. There's a lot of historical districts to it, but that place, weirdly celebrates the state sanctioned death of 19 people. It's very sort of strange place to visit. So like when I was in school, we would take field trips to Salem. We would go to the House of Seven Gables. There was the Hawthorne Hotel. So, in my part where I lived, just like the Gothic tradition was a trapping. It was something that you were just surrounded by. Now what I think for part of its enduring popularity, for lack of a better word, is I think that because it's become so pervasive within the Western literary tradition, at least, most readers go into, even if you've never been here, you come in with expectations of what a New England Gothic tale is going to be. And as a writer, it's fun because that leaves you so many options. You can lean into it, you can try to undercut it. And actually, I think, sitting here thinking now, I think that's something that Shirley did really well, especially the idea of placing these stories in these suburbs, where the idea of a suburb, especially when she was writing in the 50s and 60s, was, ooh, this is an escape from, the evils of the city. We're going to be in a safe place, and we're going to know everybody who lives next to each other. But, within her stories, it becomes very cloistering. It becomes its own horror, and it sort of recontextualizes, I think, a lot of the Gothic tradition that came before it.
yeah, I think the claustrophobia is definitely, it's a major element of all of this. Ellen, did you want to talk about this a little bit more, or?
Well, I'm from New York. I'm not a New Englander at all. And mostly my experiences is visiting Liz in Maine and, going to other places in New England. Definitely the claustrophobia of small town life. And, there are a bunch of the stories use those elements of Jackson to create new types of horror. A lot of the stories are about family, and family either being horrible things going on within a family, and then things outside affecting a family. I was thinking of Josh Mallerman's Special Meal, which actually feels very Jackson-esque to me. It's a world where math is, you cannot talk numbers, you cannot mention math. If you do, you can get executed. I mean, you've taken away from your family. And this one girl loves math. And it's basically, she's a tester is coming to test her on whether she knows math or whether she knows math, basically, and she has to play that she doesn't. And it's like a trap. And then there is Laird Barron's story, which to me is, in a way, it's very Shirley Jackson-esque, but it's also much, if you read it several times, it's really horrific. I mean, it's about things going on below the family. It seemed like a happy family. It's told from the point of view of one guy, and he's talking about his brother and his father, and everything's all happy, and his father does these tricks for him, or rather tricks him, he scares him. And then the more you read it, as you go on, you realize how horrific it is and what's really going on. It's like what goes on under the surface. And I think several of the stories are like that. And whether they're in New England or not, I'm not sure it matters, but I'm trying to think of any of the stories take place in cities. And I don't think they're urban. I think most are suburban or rural. Yeah.
Okay. That's definitely something I'm going to have to think about, because certainly the kind of the the urban strain in Jackson's, particularly in her short fiction, is really quite strong, and I think it's something that maybe deserves a little more attention in the future. But just to come back to the Shirley Jackson Awards and kind of thinking about the things that all three of you have been saying, I'd be really interested to hear about sort of how this came about, how you all fit in generally to decision-making processes around who wins. And is this, I suppose kind of really what I'm asking is, how big is the Shirley Jackson element in the Shirley Jackson Awards?
Well, you started it. You go first.
You started it. So really briefly, John Langan and I had actually heard that the International Horror Guild was no longer going to be giving awards, which I know at the time we was like, we really liked that there were the Stokers and the IHGs, and I thought there was a good balance between the two. And we felt like there really would have been a void if there was no other award besides the Stoker Awards. And so, we're like, why don't we start a horror award? So we approached, so it was John, myself, we approached Sarah Langan, F. Brett Cox, and Joanne Cox. Even though there's multiple same last names, nobody's related. We're like, okay, if we're going to start an award, like, it was just really like, what will we name it? And almost instantly, because we decided we did want to name it after a writer, it was Shirley Jackson, was unanimous for us. And I think it was the second name that might have been mentioned, but the first one that we all agreed on. So similar to what Ellen had mentioned about, obviously we had to get the estate's permission, and enthusiastic, and they were very enthusiastic about it. It's like, oh, I guess we have to do it. So the first couple of years, it was just the five of us. We were the jurors, we read everything. And it has since evolved. I mean, because the first year was 2007. But like, one of the big ideas behind the award, besides like I viewed it, I hesitate to speak for the other founders and also for the current board of directors, because I'm not on the board of directors anymore. But really, the two goals were to celebrate what's being done in modern fiction. Like the idea that, at least in 2007, when we started it, it felt like there was a lot of horror being published particularly by mainstream presses, but you wouldn't see horror on the spine. And there was a lot of sort of genre bending and blurring. And we thought Shirley Jackson represented that as an author. So one goal was to celebrate what was being done now, but also a co-goal, which we've always, taken seriously and tried to do, is to continue to celebrate Shirley's work and also to celebrate her enduring sort of influence. And then I would say Ellen and Elizabeth are parts of the awards, and have been for a long time, of what we call the board of advisors. So they'll help. They'll send. They'll send along suggestions. Because we can't necessarily. We don't have eyes everywhere. We can't get every book. So they've been very helpful in helping us see other books that we might have missed otherwise.
Yeah, and basically I just send, I mean, as I read for the years, the best horror of the year, I just send on stories that I think, or in collections and anthologies, I think that the judges, the whole board might be interested, the judges would be interested. I actually judged once.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's like, I hate judging.
Oh, it's a lot
Okay,
of
no, it
reading.
was all right. It wasn't too bad. It wasn't as bad as World Fantasy, let me tell you.
Yeah.
But no, I did judge it once. But yes, that's what as an advisor, I just send in stuff here, read this, check this out. And if you can't get it, let me know and I'll see if I can somehow get you a copy. That's what I do.
And then really,
Yeah,
the
that's
last thing
pretty
I would want to just say publicly that Joanne Cox is really the award. I mean, the amount of work that she puts into it, we can't say that enough. She's amazing.
Liz, were you gonna?
Yeah, I agree. I know. I agree. I was going to say what underscore what Paul just said about Joanne, and the others. John Langan and Paul himself, and those who've been involved for since the inception. I'm like Ellen. Mostly, all I have ever done is I read stuff, I make a note of it, and at the end of the year, whenever the time comes, I will send on to Joanne a list of things that I think are worth reading, and I try to keep an eye out for work that might go under the radar as a review. I do a lot of book reviews, and I try to cover work that may not be getting a lot of attention. So I try to ferret out those writers and books and stories that the Shirley Jackson Award is actually the ideal place for them to get attention. And over the years, not necessarily anything that I have suggested, but I think that the Shirley Jackson Awards have done a fantastic job of, bringing attention to new writers, to writers in translation, to writers who are not, American or British, who come from different literary traditions. I think that the awards really has a great track record, even if you're not looking at just the winners, but if you're running down the list of how many books are recommended or make the finalists, you're talking about, I don't know, my math is not that good, but 30 or 40 books or short stories every year that may be works that even aficionados of horror and the supernatural and fantastica might not be familiar with. And so for me, and it's always, and there's books there that, or fiction there that comes from people, all the other advisors and judges and everybody else. And for me, that's like my to read list when they come up with the finalists, to just kind of go down like, all right, have to read this, have to read this, have to read this. It's really a wonderful resource and treasury of work that deserves to be read and shared.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the evolution has been amazing, because when it first started, the first few years, I recognized most of what made the ballot. It was much more conscious of what most people thought of as horror or weird. And over the last, I'd say at least 10 years, there are more and more works on there that I'm not familiar with, and I consider myself pretty widely read in horror. And so I'm always startled by these books and these stories that in places I've never heard of. And I think that's really good. I think it's opened it up amazingly, and it's definitely evolved into very much a spiritual celebration of Shirley Jackson's work and her legacy.
It's brilliant. I think that the kind of the category busting element of it is it's really important. And I think that it really helps to carry on the legacy of what Jackson was doing in her work. And, often that was something that I think kind of throughout, say, the 70s and the 80s, literary critics were a little bit uncomfortable about that in terms of Jackson's writing, that they wanted to put her in a box. They wanted her to either do the horrific stuff or do the domestic stuff or do, the things like in the lottery collection that are practically James Joyce. They were just, stop. Would you, make up your mind? Whereas, yeah, I think it's really brilliant that this is, as you say, Ellen, this is how the awards have been going towards that kind of mixing and boundary blurring. Paul, were you going to say something there? No? Okay. Right. So
I was just going to make fun of John Langan, but the time has passed.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sure he'll hear whatever that is at some point.
He's too easy a mark.
Okay, so we're coming up towards quarter to the hour, 15 minutes to the hour. So I think we've got loads of questions in the chat. And what I might do is I might kind of mush a couple of them together because there are a few questions here by Erica Ross and Katrina Benevento and indeed Emily Ball that kind of essentially ask, you know, when you're thinking this is something that would be Shirley Jackson-esque, whether for the collection or for the awards, what comes to mind? What are the kind of characteristics that would make you say this is the right thing?
Oh, that's such a bad question.
Sorry.
It's the one where if I point to it, that's it. You know? But certain elements, I mean, tonally and her slyness, and which has been brought up, you know, her cleverness, her humor combined with horrific things, her work, domesticity. I mean, there's so many elements, you know, the suburban life, the mundane, and under the mundane, the chill underneath it, and how everybody who seems like they're just normal, great people can be really ugly underneath. That's kind of my opinion. Anyone else?
I'm not a judge, so I can't look at it from that perspective. But as a reader, you know, who's read many of the nominated works over the years, I think basically you're just coming down to something that is a great and surprising and original piece of writing. You know, there have been plenty of things that I've read that came under the rubric of, you know, the Shirley Jackson Awards that don't really seem to have very much in common at all with her own work. But they're indisputably great stories, and in some degree they deal with psychological horror or the supernatural, or they're just dark. And I think, and you know, and that's a very big tent, you know, although at the same time it's also a really small tent, like a really great unsettling piece of fiction. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I mean, we don't give, so typically we get 5 to 6 jurors per year, usually 5. You know, we really sort of leave it up to them. Like the only guidelines we give them are, some of them are just like the factual ones, like it has to be published within this calendar year type of thing in word length. But it's really left up to them to interpret what they think is the best. We certainly don't instruct jurors to think, oh, we're picking the stories that are the most Jackson-esque. No, like, again, I think, you know, so like, you know, Liz had mentioned, you know, they're going to be stories that would be hard to pinpoint, like sort of where's the influence of Shirley Jackson. We're not necessarily doing that. That said, I think what you'll find more times than not is what all those stories will have in common, besides a horror, dark, fantastic element, is just a liminal way of looking at the world, like a way of looking at it sort of maybe just out of the side a little bit, of leaving space for or exploring sort of the space in between things, which is what Ike Jackson did, whether it was her essays, her letters, or her fiction.
That is such a great way of putting it, Paul. The liminal way of looking at the world. No, I really think that's brilliant. Like, write that down fast, or I'll write it down fast so I don't forget it. Because I think that's brilliant.
And kind of a related question, which was asked by Katrina, is if any of you were to, you know, meet someone who said, I really liked Shirley Jackson, what contemporary authors or books should I be reading now? Is there anyone in particular that you'd recommend apart from yourselves?
Kelly Link.
Yes.
Kelly Link.
Well, they already said Kelly Link. I would also include Sarah Langan's most recent novel, for certain, and also Catriona Ward. You know, she's just like put on an amazing set of novels, like one per year, and each of them have been actual home runs. And I think there's a little bit of that sort of Jackson-esque wit underneath, you know, the beautiful sentences that Catriona writes.
I recently read and reviewed a book. It's not a first novel, but it was maybe a second novel by a Canadian writer named Ainsley Hogarth. And the book is called Mother Thing, one word. And it is really dark and quite grisly, and scatological in a lot of ways. But it deals a lot with women and mental illness, but also ghosts. It's really a very striking book. And to me, it read, I can't say it was, it was a difficult book to read, I found, but a really well done and disturbing. And I felt like it was a very good, 21st century retort or riff on Shirley Jackson's work.
Actually, so since you brought up
my
oh no,
okay?
yeah, we can hear you. Are you with us? Still got very seance-like. So yeah, since you brought up kind of women's experience and the gender aspect of a lot of this, and I know that a lot of you have been, naming female writers, which is just, yeah, I think, as you said, Liz, earlier, this is just so great in terms of genre fiction, since there was a long period where it seemed like it was dominated by male writers. There's been a question in the chat specifically for Paul about kind of gender elements in A Head Full of Ghosts. Talking about the critique of misogynistic culture woven into Mary's tale without right criticism of her later blog posts about the entire series. And this is from Heidi Bax, who wonders if in part this aspect might also be influenced by Shirley's work, which centered the horror of women's lived experience as the baseline of her literary career. And I suppose, Paul, if you wanted to start us off, and maybe other people could chime in.
Sure. I would say the answer is definitely yes. I mean, the start of A Head Full of Ghosts, I mean, it was a little bit of a logic, a work of logic for me, when I started with, okay, how would I wanted to tell a sort of a skeptical possession story, was the beginning of it. And once I knew that I couldn't avoid, Blatty's book, or just exorcisms in general, or basically horror fiction, how horror movies in particular, have sexualized, pubescent and prepubescent girls in these movies. So all of that was rolling around. And once I hit upon that, oh, my Mary is going to be, inspired or based on a little bit, or from one of my, from Mary Cat Blackwood, it was an easy sort of jump for me there to have that, to try to have some of that voice and have that discussion within the book. And again, like, one of my favorite short stories of Shirley's is The Intoxicated. And how she weaves sort of gender politics within that story is just so brilliant. Something, I would never be able to do for a variety of reasons. So, all of that was sort of like swimming in the ether of A Head Full of Ghosts.
Liz, I think you were going to say something there. No. I mean, Ellen, do you have any thoughts on kind of gender distinctions or any? Okay. No, Paul, were you going to say something else there?
Oh, no, sorry. Just itchy trigger finger.
Yes, and it's getting towards the end of the day, so maybe we might see if we can just squeeze in one more question. So actually, yeah, just to kind of tie back in with some of the things that were being said in one of the earlier panels, we have an interesting question here from Helena Black, I think, who was wondering if the three of you could speak a little bit about the influence of real life criminal cases. And she's thinking in particular about kind of how Jackson's humorous family stories blurred the lines between fact and fiction, but also how she was frequently inspired by real life cases, for example, in Castle and Hill House. And we get a sort of young female murderer in The Sundial as well. And yeah, I suppose I was just kind of thinking back to Gretchen mentioning that they got that murder archive, which I'm absolutely fascinated about, and I really want to know more about it. And certainly, Liz, I know that you often wander into the sort of crime genre in your fiction, and I don't know, how do we feel about the overlap between real life crime and fiction?
I loved hearing Gretchen's comment about that, about the murder books. I have always loved and been repelled by true crime stories. Ellen, you may remember this from growing up in New York. The New York Daily News, the Sunday News used to have something every week, a feature called A Justice Story of America.
Yes,
And they were true crime stories that they were illustrated with, the original grainy black and white photographs of the crime scenes. They were like Ouija photos. And they ran in the Daily News every Sunday, and I was obsessed with them. They were really gruesome and horrific, and they were not long features, but that kind of got me hooked from an early age on true crime stuff. And basically, even now, unfortunately, you read any account of a crime, and for me anyway, I'm reading it and thinking like, I couldn't make this up. Who could make this stuff up? So I've always been reassured by the fact that Shirley Jackson took some of her, impetus, or the incipit for some of her works came from actual case histories or incidents or stories that she read about, because I certainly do. And then obviously, I riff off of them the way that I'm sure others do. That was one of the things about A Head Full of Ghosts that I loved. It felt like that kind of a real life account of something. I think there's, the form that it took, the narrative form, obviously lent itself to that. But I've just always found that a really intoxicating kind of story to read, and a fun kind of story to write.
Yeah, I would say it is sort of like a fun narrative technique to go toward, even if the story itself isn't based off of something, totally new. So I don't know, I don't want to say it was a true crime phase, but right on when I first started writing, my aunt, very lovely person. She's only like 19 years older than me, so she's almost like a combination of another mother and a big sister. But she was buying me serial killer books, and that actually, once I read one of them, like I said, I'm gonna try to write a short story about a serial killer, and it was terrible, but it was the first thing that I ever wrote. But it has been like really amazing to see how story and true crime have sort of really mixed and changed things, like the explosion of the popularity of it within the last 5 years. And just even with my own house, my wife Lisa, like we joke, like she's watching her murder shows, she listens to the murder podcasts, and we just had somebody murdered in town. She's like, I already figured it out because I went to her Facebook page and and saw this and that. And so it's just like, yeah, I don't know. It feels like we're beginning to even live like within our own narratives, as well as like telling them, but not always being honest about them. And I guess that's sort of what I did with A Head Full of Ghosts. So no, like, I guess it's a long way of saying is I'm definitely interested in how those things where true life and narrative sort of interweave but also diverge.
Shirley would be proud, I think. So we could probably talk about this all night, but unfortunately we're running out of time, and the discussions can continue on our Discord server, and also on social media if you're that way inclined. And once again, all the links to our various platforms are in the chat, and they're also available on our webpage, Reading Shirley Jackson in the 21st Century. So first of all, I would like to thank our three panelists for a really excellent discussion that, like I say, we could have just kept going. And in addition, I would also like to thank the various people who made this event possible, in particular, School of English in Trinity College Dublin, and also the Trinity Long Room Hub, especially Emily Johnson, who did some really heroic work making all of this possible in the fairly complex webinar format. And so I'd like to thank all of our incredibly excellent panelists throughout the entire event for their time and engagement and for generously giving us all of those things. We'd also like to thank Sarah Cullen in the Dean of Research Office in Trinity for her work in promoting the event, and indeed the wider project that we're all involved in on Shirley Jackson. We'd like to thank Orla Donnelly for her moral support over the last few weeks. And also Data Too Short for the wonderful artwork that was created for this event, some of which you can see in front of you. And their Ko-Fi is up the side if you're interested in helping them out, or indeed getting them to make some posters for your own future event. So to all of our attendees, we would like to thank you so much for attending. And finally, as always, we would like to thank Shirley Jackson. for bringing us all together in celebration of her life, her work, her birthday, and her remarkable literary and cultural heritage. So thank you all so much.